Back in the saddle again.
Okay, now watch what you say. I'm starting the live stream right this minute so I can get the link. I'm gonna.
I see it up in the left-hand corner.
I have it paused and muted, but if you click on that, is there a down arrow next to the live on YouTube?
View stream on YouTube, copy streaming link.
Yeah, if you say view stream, you can go over there and it should pull it up for you.
Streaming link.
Yeah, if you say view stream, you can go over there and it should pull it up for you. Now you want to make sure that your that YouTube stream is the mic is, or the sound is muted on that YouTube. You don't want that sound interrupting.
I just clicked off of it.
Okay.
Because you're right, there's a time delay.
Mm-hmm. Come on, Liz.
And I just texted her again, asking her to join us.
Yeah. And I just copied the streaming link, and I'm going to go out to Facebook and put that in our. I was having lots of internet problems yesterday and the day before. Hopefully I won't have those today. If I do, you'll have to take over the 100% of the duty.
Don't tell me that. Because I'm not a host right now.
I know. So far it's real stable, so I had to restart my router. That's the first time I've ever had to do that.
Wow. Well, Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. I mean, I know she's done this 100 times, but you know, it's.
Yeah, well, this is recording, Mike.
Well, she's a real pro.
Yep.
But now John Detras, he cuts all this down. Oh, there, Linda has entered the waiting room.
Okay. You could probably let Linda Kerr.
I don't know. But I was hoping that would have said Liz. Waiting. 3 people have entered the waiting room.
Let's hope Liz isn't using somebody else's computer if you don't recognize the names of the people. Something we didn't think to ask her.
Well, I connected Linda because the other ones have names.
Yeah, but Linda came on without a mic. I've never quite understood how somebody, oh, they haven't connected yet with audio.
I'm going to check my email just to.
Hello.
Is that you, Linda Kerr?
That is me. I just responded to you too, Michael. I sent you a reply the other day and then I sent one to Terry Doherty. That puzzles me.
Well, Terry, I just got your email. Terry, I'm sure got it. I did not, but anyway.
Okay, I sent yours first.
Well, you know what? Terry has priority, so it's good to
Okay.
hear from you.
I'll be there.
Yeah, and Linda, we'll be leaving everybody's mic muted when we get started here, and we're waiting for Liz to appear, and we didn't recognize your last name because it's not in your name, and we're concerned that Liz might come on with somebody else's computer.
So
So
do I need to do something?
Nope, just stay your cute self.
yeah,
Yeah, well.
we'll let you chat with us until Liz comes on board, and then I'm going to mute you. How's
Okay,
that?
that's fine.
In
You
fact,
can give Gary a hug for me.
Will do. He turned 67 years old today.
Hey.
And we celebrated by giving him a new great nephew this morning. So
Wonderful.
a good day.
It certainly is.
you know who Caroline
I do not.
Fairheller is?
I do not. I don't want to bug Liz, but you know, and maybe she, I mean, she's done 100 of these, so maybe it's not a big deal, but.
Yeah, but if she comes on last second, you know, the Siraj Library Project and who that might be?
I do know the Siraj Library Project, and that's not her.
Well, we can admit people and they're gonna be muted. They can hear us, but
No,
I
I
didn't-
prefer not to do that right now, Terry. 'Cause
yeah, I was gonna suggest we could admit John since we're waiting like we did with Linda.
You can mute me. I don't care.
Yeah, I knew you'd be amenable to it, Linda. That's why I
Yeah.
let you in.
I think my girlfriend Amy's going to try to come on this call.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that we don't have more people.
Well, it's still 6 till. I mean, it's.
I was expecting this to be inundated.
Oh,
Well, one of the problems is I logged in and it held me in ready state until just now.
Well, I know, but everybody's being held in the waiting room, John.
yeah, we let you sit there, John. We were letting you. cool your heels.
I admitted you here. We're keeping everybody in the waiting room,
Okay.
but there's only 2 other people waiting. That's the issue. I expected there'd be 50 or 60 by now. Hi, John.
Hello.
And we're gonna mute everybody when we get ready to go with the interview, John.
Sure.
And you won't be able to unmute yourself once we do that.
That's good. I'd like to get that. I may switch over to Zoom so I can mute everybody when I do my general meetings. I'm having trouble with them unmuting.
Well, and then I would have you also just, in fact, I think I might be able to, can I? Yeah, I can stop your video too. So
Yeah, probably.
yeah, what we're doing is when Mike is interviewing, I spotlight whoever the speaker is, Mike or the interviewee. But
Yeah,
if other people are turning their cameras on, it can be distracting.
exactly.
So we're just asking people to leave their cameras off. That's one that I haven't figured out how to block.
Oh,
The mic you can definitely block. I can turn it back off when they turn their camera on, but I can't turn it off.
Hi, Liz. This is Michael Spath from Fort Wayne, Indiana. It's 5 minutes till 2, and we're waiting for you to check in with us here on Zoom. So we were supposed to be in touch. You were supposed to be on at 15 minutes ago, and so we're getting a little concerned because our interview is supposed to start at 2 o'clock. So please let me know what's going on, okay? And we're hoping to see you very, very shortly. We got folks waiting in the waiting room, waiting to join in and hear us have our conversation. See you soon. Bye.
And SE is usually Steve after.
That's right. That's right.
So I went ahead and
I called her and left a message, so it went right to voicemail. So she says she's getting on. Apologies.
Okay.
So let's look for her and we'll let her on right away. And
And we've got, hopefully we'll have a lot more people show up here momentarily, but Liz is first priority.
well, if we don't start until 5 after, that's okay too, you know.
Oh, hey, we can send a message to the folks in the waiting room, and I don't know how the message appears to them because
I will let you do that.
yeah. I'm just saying the meeting will start momentarily. Because we're gonna just have to go for it once
It
Liz.
says I'm waiting to be let in.
Well, she must be Carol then.
I'm in the waiting room, she says.
See if Carol is Liz. That's the problem. She might be using somebody else's computer or somebody else's ID. Because I just got Reverend Murphy. I'm going to unmute Carol.
Hi, guys.
Hello, who is this?
Carol.
Hi, Carol.
Good to see you.
Well, I do not see any. Oh, there she is. There's Liz. Yeah, I just admitted her. Okay. Everybody else is getting unmuted or getting muted.
Hey, hi.
I'm really sorry. I don't know what happened. I'm sorry to be late, and then I'm sorry if I did something wrong.
No. Good to see you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, really good to meet you.
Good. Thank you for all your work, all your leadership. We've been following you, and we're happy to be a part of the Poor People's Campaign.
we're really glad that you're a part, and yeah, I'm interested in the work y'all are doing as well, and want to have us all lift this all up.
Please include me if there's as you go forward, and as we start gathering together. I'm pretty available to travel all around the country, and I'd be happy to join you in the demonstrations and all the rest.
Oh, amazing.
We're really wanting to take our organization, and myself personally are very interested in becoming more an integral part of the work of the Poor People's Campaign.
Well, we need that. We need that in Indiana, and we need that across the country. So,
Mike, it's two. Let me admit everyone. And Liz, I made you a co-host, which means you'll be able to control your camera and mic.
Okay.
Because I'm going to make sure everybody else stays muted.
Okay.
During the program. So,
Perfect.
and I'm going to turn my camera off.
And Liz, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be monitoring the chat room and all the rest. I've got questions. You don't have to worry about you don't have to worry about having a chance to talk about June the 20th. You don't have to worry about having a chance to talk about the Stay in Place, Stay Alive. I'll prompt you on those. I've got a list of questions. What I'm trying to say is you don't have to try to squeeze everything into the first answer to the first question. You know what I mean?
All right. I can
and
comfortably go through.
And yeah, so I just want you to know, but I do have some other questions I want you to address, and we'll get to the major campaigns and the major events.
Love it. Love it. Love it.
And the only other thing I'd ask is after we're all done, if you could stay on for just a few more minutes so that you and I could just have just 5 minutes or so together, I'd appreciate it.
Perfect.
The final thing I want to say is when we get near the end, I'm going to let Reverend Theoharis have the last word, but then I'm going to make a public service announcement on behalf of our organization here about our interview next week.
Awesome.
And then I'm going to come back to you for some final words.
Perfect. I got it.
And just a reminder, I'm Michael Spath, and your host organization is the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace.
Awesome.
All righty.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, it's good to have you on.
And Michael, I'll hit the record button whenever you say go.
And I'm pretty strict about keeping this to about 75 minutes at max, Liz. So we'll do it that way. Is that all right with you? Good.
Whatever's good.
All righty. So are you ready for us to begin?
I am.
Good. Well then, Terry, why don't you hit the record button and I'll start. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Spath, and I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, based in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We're the Indiana voice for peace, justice, human rights, and intercultural encounter. To prevent Zoom bombing, your cameras will be turned off and your mics will be muted. But if you would like to submit a question for our guest today, we ask that you do so via the chat function at the bottom of the screen, where I'll be monitoring for your questions. This is the second in our series, Voices of Justice, Human Rights, and Moral Revival. And we're delighted to speak with Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, the director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary, and co-chair with Reverend Dr. William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. So Liz, welcome. Welcome to our interview today. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Thanks for the work you're doing, Michael.
Thank you. You have a number of folks who are interested in you personally. So before we get into and maybe some of your friends who are on our interview today. So before we get into the work of the Poor People's Campaign and other work you're doing, just tell us how you're doing during this time of the pandemic.
Yeah. So these are crazy times, right? I'm hanging on, and my family is doing okay. Uh, I live in New York City, and I'm currently staying with my in-laws, so that the kids can have a place to be outside of the city a little bit. But you know, I'm pretty sad and pretty mad most days. You know, every day I hear of someone in our work who's contracted it, who's lost their job, whose family members have died. And this is on top of already the massive homelessness, the massive hunger, the lack of healthcare, the lack of living wages. And so, I mean, these are surely dark and difficult days, with dark and difficult ones to come. But I myself am hanging on and holding on. So thanks for asking.
Good, good. Well, let's get right into it. Okay, Liz. One of the real startling and yet sadly unsurprising developments during this pandemic is the cavalier attitude of the powerful, and especially those on the religious and political right, about the expendability of the loss of life for some of our fellow citizens and part of the human family. That some lives are worth less than others, so that we can reopen the economy, right? We're closing on 100,000 lives lost just in this country due to COVID-19. You and Reverend Barber have both been talking about how this pandemic has exposed the already present fissures in American society with regard to race, poverty, jobs, healthcare. That is the impact of predatory capitalism. And one of the ways it's played out is how service workers and farm workers have all of a sudden become essential workers, yet are still being treated and paid like expendables. So say a little bit more about that and expand upon your understanding of essential people versus expendable people and that kind of framing that's happening in our country.
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly the United States has a high tolerance for death, especially when it's the death of poor people and people of color and marginalized communities, right? Before COVID-19 had even hit, before it was declared a pandemic, before we were even fully aware of what kind of the full brunt of what it was going to bring to us or anywhere in the world. There were 250,000 people dying from poverty every year, more than heart attacks, strokes, and cancer combined in the United States. That's about 700 people a day. And yet, even though we have the resources to do something about it, even though we have the solutions to those problems, they weren't being resolved then. And this has only just made the expendability of people all the more apparent. You know, I think that talking about essential workers, and I was on an event last week where we had a number of campaign leaders from Kansas, from Texas, from Maine, from New York, from all over, folks who are, you know, so-called essential workers, you know, folks that are working at McDonald's and still for the same wage that they were making 17 years ago when they first started working at McDonald's. You know, folks that are working at Costco and only getting paid sick leave if they have a doctor's note that declares that they for sure had COVID-19 and not if they had another flu or another virus, or if you can't get it documented by a doctor. Folks from, you know, other big box stores who have seen it to be very clear that what it is to be essential is to not have any of your essentials met. What it is to be, you know, so you get this little button from McDonald's that says, I am essential, but your wages and your organizing rights and your healthcare rights are still, you know, not provided. And so those kinds of contradictions we're seeing all over the place. You know, when you look at the 25 communities, rural communities that are most impacted by COVID-19, it's where there are indigenous reservations, it's where there are poultry plants, it's where there are meat packing plants, it's where you have large numbers of farm workers, you know, picking the produce that line our grocery stores. And so what you can tell is that, you know, that some people's lives matter only in ways that they're about making the rich richer. And that, you know, if people have to go, if people have to die, I mean, to see what's happened with these reopenings in states, that the rhetoric is about helping people out. The rhetoric is about, you know, helping the poor and getting the economy working for everyone. But the reality is it's about cutting people off of unemployment. It's about making folks go back to work for you know, no hero pay. It's about making sure that the rich continue to get rich. And so, you know, this is deeply immoral. You know, as a Christian pastor, as a biblical scholar, the Bible has a lot to say about hurting and killing the poor at the expense of, you know, enriching and engorging the rich. That in fact is something that the prophets decry throughout the ages. That's something that Jesus stands firmly against, and yet we see it happening so much right now.
I want you to expand upon that, but in this context, I'm preaching via Zoom this weekend, and I'm going to be quoting you on Sunday, you and Reverend Barber in a sermon on a recent call with prophetic leaders. You and Reverend Barber said that what's needed is a loving yet truthful resistance. And I don't remember which one of you said it, but you added, and I'm going to just quote here because I wrote it down. Let's stop talking about a return to normal. Normal before COVID-19 was 140 million people living in poverty. We don't need to repeat the failures of the old system in order to know it was failing. Don't give us flyovers and hand clapping at 7 o'clock and flags waving if you're not going to also provide us a living wage and free health care. What's needed is a moral revival, a revolution of values to save the heart and soul of democracy. So with that, and given your talk about a Christian pastor and the values of the prophets and the message of Jesus, talk about this moral revolution and loving yet truthful resistance. That is the Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah, so indeed, I mean, you know, there's many prophets that I go to on a regular basis, but one is surely the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who is very well versed in the biblical prophets. And I don't know if folks are familiar, but you know, even just like a week or so before the March on Washington speech that we now know as the I Have a Dream speech, he was debating what to call those remarks. And one of the ideas, the running idea was normalcy, never again. And so even back then, there was this idea that was rooted actually in biblical prophecy, that the kind of racism, that the levels of poverty, that the kind of inequality that existed is exactly against the moral standards of our sacred traditions and texts, and even the founding of this nation, right? And so I think what we're seeing and what we're saying, because it's coming out of folks that are compelled to act in these moments, you know, folks who are taking care of each other and family and friends and organizing, you know, whether it's to cancel rent, or whether it's to open hospitals, or whether it's to take over abandoned housing units, or whether it's to start moratoriums on water shutoffs, is that we need a moral resistance from the ground up, that says no to the death and the devastation, that says no from the profiteering off of pandemic, that says no to the being able to decide whose lives matter, but instead asserts the fullness of our sacred traditions, which says that life is sacred, all life is sacred, or that quotes our founding documents of the United States of, we hold these truths self-evident that all are created equal, right? And what we're seeing in the response, and in what we're seeing in even the pandemics of racism and poverty, ecological devastation, and militarism and war that preceded COVID-19, is that that life is being made unworthy, that there is a division between deserving and undeserving. When we have political leaders saying that we need to cut people off of unemployment, not expand unemployment, when we've had record numbers, we have close to 40 million people on the unemployment, applying for unemployment. Never before in this country's history have we had this. And you have political leaders who have bailed out their friends and those lobbyists and those corporations to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars, who are saying, no, we can't to extend unemployment benefits anymore right now because it might discourage people from working. Well, what isn't working is the system.
We're here again now, resurrected again, don't we? The language of the deserving and undeserving poor, right? I mean, that's been a trope for decades, but now it's really come back in the vocabulary of those on the right again.
No, that's exactly true. And, I think that this has been, I've been doing grassroots anti-poverty organizing for, more than 2 decades, more than 25 years, in fact. And this debate of who deserves versus who doesn't, who is at fault and who is just a victim of circumstance, what people should have versus, what are, what you shouldn't. I mean, this comes up all the time, and again is usually cloaked in religious rhetoric, right? I mean, I think about some of the Bible passages that have had the biggest impact in my life, right? This passage from 2 Thessalonians, if you do not work, you shall not eat, right? I never knew that passage. I was teaching Sunday school by the age of 13. I was a deacon by 16, right? I knew my Bible in and out, and I had never heard that passage until welfare reform in the 1990s, right? And then you hear it now as they try to attach, work requirements. And what it is this trying to create this deserving. Well, Jesus never asked for a handout, this kind of stuff. And I mean, for one, it's just a blatant lie, right? I mean, actually that passage from Paul's letter to the Thessalonians is actually saying exactly the opposite. It's actually a warning to the rich who are not working and making the poor work for them. But separate from that, like this happens all the time throughout history, and we must resist it. In fact, I think it's one of the most important moral kind of calls of our time right now, is to say that all life has value, all work has value, all people have value, and that if a society over the course of a couple of weeks can find trillions of dollars to bail out the rich and make billionaires even more wealthy, then this lie that we can't do any better than this, that this lie of scarcity, this lie of who's deserving and undeserving is exactly that. It's a lie. And we need to, do something else.
One of the most powerful aspects of the Poor People's Campaign, I think, is, and again, going back to the original Poor People's Campaign envisioned by King, is that it's not only about creating new social programs or new public policies. It really is about a revolution of values, to quote the Poor People's Campaign. And of course, for religious people, to take back their religions
That's right.
right? To take back their religions.
That's right. I mean, again, as a biblical scholar, as a pastor, as a mom and a daughter and an activist, I mean, what you have in our faith traditions is an arc of justice, right? The founding story of the Bible is Exodus. It's about a movement to get out of slavery and exploitation. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures are all kinds of teachings about how you're supposed to organize society, not just your church, not just your little community, how you're supposed to organize whole nations, whole societies around the needs of the poor. And that actually, when you do so, when you care for your neighbor, when you welcome in the immigrant stranger, then you're actually loving and caring for and honoring God, right? You have the prophets who denounce, exploiting the poor. And then you have, in the New Testament, story after story, epistle after epistle, gospel after gospel that talks about, bringing good news to the Potokos, those who have been made poor by systems of injustice, right? And so again, we have to get back to what the actual true core and center of our faith traditions is, and that is about, promoting justice and making sure that we meet all needs, and that those are, again, the moral issues of our day, that healthcare is what God cares about, that living wages is what all people deserve, that wealth inequality should be no more, and that we should study war no more, and in fact, divest from this war economy and move it into a peace economy.
Well, yeah, exactly. One of our dear friends is Pastor Mitri Raheb from Bethlehem. And when they were re-envisioning, when they were re-envisioning the mission of Little Christmas Church in Bethlehem 15, 20 years ago, they took on the motto of, from the Gospel of John, Jesus came to, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. And they started with this, just a very simple question: what does the abundant life look like?
That's right.
And so when you talk about jobs and healthcare and a living wage, nourishment for young mothers, and their newborn children, and, the whole expanse of the abundant life and what that looks like in real life. That's at the heart of the Poor People's Campaign, really. What does the abundant life look like?
That's right. And, we put together, we first did this thing called the Souls of Poor Folk Audit, where we were trying to get an empirical and anecdotal study of what has happened in the United States over the past 50 years since Dr. King had launched the Poor People's Campaign in 67 and 68. And what we...
Say it again, what was the name of that study again?
It's called the Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America 50 Years After the Poor People's Campaign. And you can find it on the Poor People's Campaign website. It's a pretty substantial document. Some of the best think tanks in the country, along with impacted leaders, along with policymakers, really pulled it together for us. We commissioned it. And in it, we show that there's, 140 million people who are poor and low income, even according to US Census standards. We show that we have fewer voting rights today than we did 54 years ago. It shows that, that there's 15 million families that can't afford water and 4 million who, when they turn their taps on, have poison coming out of it. It shows, and not just this list of statistics, but it shows how that plays out and how these all interlock and intersect. And then from there, we developed this Poor People's Moral Agenda. And then folks started to question, well, yeah, it's great that you have this list of demands. It's great that you've, put all of these things together, but you're asking for too much. What are the one or two things that poor people really need? And we said, well, the corporations, the lobbyists, they don't have to choose one or two. They want it all, they get it all, right? We've seen this in the bailouts so far of this pandemic. And so let us show you that it's actually costing our society more to have the levels of poverty and racism and inequality in it than it would be to address it. Let us show you that if we cut the military budget in half and still had a larger military budget than Russia and Iran and China and many other countries combined, right? If we had a fair taxation system, where we tax those who can afford it the most a little bit more, and what if we invested not in militarism, not in gun rights, not in inequality, but what if we invested in child welfare programs, right? Every dollar spent on early childhood education saves our society $7 in the future, right? So it's a good investment. Every dollar that we spend on SNAP is, creates, 7 more jobs than any dollar that you spend on the military, right? So this idea that we can't do it any differently, we can't be any better, we put together in a Poor People's Moral Budget. And again, you can get that budget also on the Poor People's Campaign website, and it's called Everybody's Got a Right to Live, a Poor People's Moral Budget. And in it, we show just how much it's actually costing our society not to implement the demands of the campaign. And not that we should just have to choose 1 or 2 things, but in fact, actually, that our whole society would be stronger for everybody if we were to implement these demands. That again, we have the saying in our work where when you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. And so, we're proposing to do just that and have a bold, comprehensive agenda that we've done the empirical work around that shows that, in fact, all of these things, universal health care and childhood education, living wage jobs and the right to have a job, guaranteed adequate income, and so many of the different injustices that people are seeing don't have to be this way. And in fact, the amount of money that our country spent on that immoral wall at the US-Mexico border could have expanded Medicaid in 14 states, just for one iteration of it. That the kind of money we spend on just 1 or 2 defense contracts, could eliminate all of student debt. And so it doesn't have to be this way. It's that we don't have a scarcity of resources. We have a scarcity of political will. And so how do we change that will? But we organize.
I want to come back to that sentiment and talk about Indiana and some other things. But before we get too much further into the interview, I want us to be able to highlight a couple of the campaigns that are coming up. We're in the middle of one right now this week. All 50 states have instituted some form of reopening, putting people at risk.
That's
frankly.
Right.
The Poor People's Campaign has also this week, though, called for the Stay in Place, Stay Alive, Organize, and Don't Believe the Lies campaign. So I want you to say a word not only about Stay in Place, Stay Alive, and Organize, but also why it's necessary, why it's so critically necessary at this time that we do what you're asking us to do.
Yeah, so what this is, and we had a big day of action yesterday, and we're asking people to keep on calling McConnell and Pelosi and talking about a real relief bill, to keep emailing and mailing and contacting governors in the states and saying, until you've enacted all of these demands that the Poor People's Campaign has come out with, and then you haven't done enough. Even if you're proud of yourself and you live in a state that hasn't opened up, entirely, that if your state is cutting education and bolstering the police, that's immoral and wrong, and that what we're calling for is mass non-cooperation and resistance to such edicts that basically put the lives, especially of poor people, especially of essential workers, especially of low-wage workers, in jeopardy. We've already been doing this, but to not believe the lie that this is really to benefit our society and to bring things back, as we were talking about earlier, to normal. And so So the campaign is happening on a local, on a state, and on a national level. There's some powerful organizing and resistance work that folks are doing. We're trying to amplify and lift that up. So if you're engaged in a rent strike, if you're engaged in, protesting outside, even in a socially distant way around the closing of healthcare centers in your community, that folks need to know that there's this kind of resistance happening. It's happening on a state level, and that we're trying to pressure our governors, our state representatives, our state senators to make sure that actually how is it we're in a public health crisis and there has been no expansion of healthcare at all? And in fact, what's happened, because in this country, healthcare is connected to people's jobs, we now have tens of millions more people without healthcare, in a public health crisis, when we already had tens of millions of people without healthcare in a country that spends more on healthcare than any other nation in the world. And yet, what we've seen from both sides of the aisle, from both parties, has been resistance to actually enacting a healthcare, not expanding Medicaid in the states that haven't expanded it. There's still 14 states that haven't expanded Medicaid. Those states are currently about to just be crushed by this problem around public health and the lack of infrastructure and just this virus that is not controlled in this country yet. But let alone the fact that what we're seeing in this public health crisis is that a privatized health system makes absolutely no sense. And is in fact immoral, right? We've also seen that there's been no call for living wages in this pandemic. Again, we can call, as we started off, we can call people essential. We can give them little buttons. We can clap for them at 7. We can thank them for their sacrifice on Facebook. But the fact that
doesn't cost a whole lot, does it?
No, and again, it's costing our society to not have living wage jobs, right? It's part of the reason people are being forced to go to work and choose between going to work sick, because we also don't have paid sick leave. For the vast majority, even of workers, still they're not in these stimulus provisions. Still, upwards of 80% of workers are not guaranteed paid sick leave, let alone when you're not in a pandemic, right? Workers on the whole, and they haven't been making wages where people can afford, a week or 2 or 3 to get better and healthy. And so, much of the spread of this virus from early on was because people, couldn't stay home because it meant that they were going to lose their housing. The fact that we've seen that there's going to be a 40% increase. This isn't us saying this. This is like the biggest think tanks in the country saying this. There's going to be a 40% increase of homelessness in a country that already had more than 10 million people that were homeless. We can build a prefab house in 45 minutes. We have more luxury housing units that are empty in this country than homeless people, but we've seen no provisions. There's been a little bit of like, okay, we'll stop moratoriums, but it's not that people aren't then still racking up rent. It's that then when the moratorium on evictions is over, then you're going to owe thousands of dollars that you will never have the money to pay. And then there'll be mass evictions, and there'll be mass homelessness. And so the fact that we can have spent trillions and trillions of dollars and not taken up some of these very key utilities, right? Now we're all seeing that we all need the internet. We all need our data on our cell phone plans. And yet, those rates are just going up and up and up in this pandemic, and that there's no guarantee. And yet you have 55 million children who are basically on online learning systems because the public schools have had to close for health reasons. And how do you manage that when you don't have the right to the internet, when you don't have access to computer technologies for many people? And so anyways, this shows all of these inequities. And then the resolution is to bail out the rich. It's the resolution is to have millionaires and billionaires making millions and billions off of this and leaving the rest of us. And it's a huge section of people to just fend for ourselves.
Well, and as we pointed out earlier on, all these feel-good gestures that cost us nothing and yet cost us everything. In other words, they cost us nothing to do them, but it costs the society.
That's right.
And really costs our souls everything. I want to get to June 20th, but I have another question I want to insert here. We have an active Poor People's Campaign group in Indianapolis and here in Fort Wayne, Liz. But as you know, Indiana is traditionally a red state, the state that gave the country Mike Pence. You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Our local leader here, Pastor Kimberly Kozan-Flory, wanted me to ask you, how have you seen effective power building that can change political will, and how can we seize the moment? She also just chatted here, so let me just read what she said here.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we in Indiana are organizing conversations to ask county and city officials to assure non-eviction orders, rent forgiveness, etc., nonviolent resistance to overly aggressive police action in Indianapolis. And in Fort Wayne, we're surveying custodial staff and healthcare facilities who are reporting a lack of proper PPE when cleaning in COVID-positive rooms. So again, we have an active group here, and Kimberly Kozan-Flory, Pastor Kimberly Kozan-Flory, wants you to say a word about effective power building that can change political will and seizing this moment, especially in a red state, where people's minds really need to be changed.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing, we were seeing this before as we were building the Poor People's Campaign, and we're seeing this now in this pandemic, is that most of our states aren't red states or blue states. They're mostly unorganized states, right? And that what has to happen is that we have to organize and unite people across all of these lines. And I think what we're seeing in this pandemic, in fact, is that there are some folks that are starting to pay attention to these issues. There are both people in power, but then also just, regular, people of goodwill and conscience who maybe had been less familiar with the levels of inequality, the level of poverty, the kind of fissures that existed in this society before, but who are being awakened to them and don't like what they're seeing. Don't think that this is how this nation should be, and are there for the organizing. And I think that a lot of what our work is how do we reach out, to folks that we already have been connected to, as well as new people, and unite ourselves around a common agenda. So what is it that's most impacting people in Indiana right now? And how do we then, have a public information campaign about those issues? How is it that you use all these online technologies that are here and people are now kind of starting to use them more to connect people up who maybe weren't connected before? And then how do you, we know that even when hundreds of people call our senators and call our representatives, it drives them nuts, right? So so what is it if people, are still trapped at home, or even if they're loosening some of these, socially distanced restrictions, folks are still, trying to figure out how to respond to this moment and how to, get ready to be able to bring more people into our work. So what does it look like for us to be flooding, calling? What does it look like for us to be reaching out to, maybe communities that we didn't reach out to before, whether it's congregations or whether it's community organizations or whether it's, sororities and fraternities, or whether it's labor unions and locals, or whether it's an environmental group or a peace group. And how is it that, that we use this moment to say, can we unite, that our lives are not expendable? Can we come together to say that this idea of there being some people that are deserving and some people that are undeserving just is anathema to us? And what will it take for us to be able to kind of come together in power with demands? And I think what we're seeing is that when folks are doing that, those are the very people who are winning, rent freezes. Those are the very, constituencies that are winning PPE for essential workers. And it's where we're not organized that we're not able to kind of have the power and influence to, win those, and then not stop at that. If we win PPE for some low-wage workers, next week, then let's have that be the beginning of an organizing campaign, not that look at us, we won that and now we're done, because we know that the second that they can, they'll take that away from us as well. And so how do we become, in the words of one of my brother organizers in El Paso, Texas, with organizing at the border, how do we become permanently organized communities where no matter what is happening, we all have each other's backs, we all know each other's issues, and we're in this together. You're on mute.
You've noticed on the screen that I'm a white male. Liz of a certain age and socioeconomic class. So my privilege has several levels attached to it. One of the strengths of the Poor People's Campaign, right, has been the importance of prioritizing heretofore silenced or marginalized voices of labor, of women, of people of color, the immigrant and refugee, LGBTQ voices, and others. And so say a word about how critically necessary and important that is for this movement at this time in our country.
I mean, I think what history shows us is that movements are only successful when those that are most impacted by the injustices that they're trying to solve come together in leadership and help to forge those movements, right? And so, it's possible for us to kind of imagine the abolitionist movement without slaves and ex-slaves, in the leadership of that, or the women's suffrage movement. Would we actually have the women's right to vote if it had only been men who had said, should we let women vote? So again, like, history shows us that those that are most impacted, and Frederick Douglass has this really nice saying about that. He says, those who would be free must strike the first blow. Only those in pain know when their pain is relieved, right? And I think that that's a powerful statement of strategy, of not just kind of morality, but of how you win, right? And my favorite quote from Reverend Dr. King is, the poor and dispossessed of this nation live in a cruelly unjust society. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. And so, I mean, I think it's a beautiful statement. And I actually, most days that I wake up, read that statement and think, okay, what am I doing? And what are we as a campaign doing? And what are we as a society doing to help the poor or those who have little or nothing to lose, take action together? And how are we going to unsettle this complacent national life, right? And yet, what also history tells us is that you need broad-based movements that have people from all walks of life involved. And when you look at the issue of poverty today, it's not some small section of people. I mean, if before COVID-19 even hit, before this massive unemployment numbers hit, before this significant public health crisis that's pushing many, many more people into poverty and dispossession hit, there were nearly half of the US population that was experiencing some form of poverty or one small emergency away from it, then you're not talking about just one group of people over here. You know, the statistics that we have is that, you know, there are, you know, 60% of African Americans are poor, and that's about 26 million people. Only about a third of white people are poor, but that's 66 million people. And so in raw numbers, actually, it's more people, more white people who are poor than African American, Latinos, Native, Asian Americans. And so, and yes, more women are poor than men, and more, you know, young and old people are poor than those in the middle. But poverty on some level, you know, is impacting everybody. And so, you know, I think it's helpful for us to realize that and recognize that and see that then when we say those most impacted, it means a cross section of people from different geographies, from different racial ethnic groups, from different issue areas, from different religions, who are all coming together. And even if we need those most impacted in the forefront, we need people from all walks of life to be involved, because again, this is not about isolating poor people to go fight poor people's battles. This is about coming together as a society to say, we can do better than this. And that when we do better for anybody, it actually is better for everybody.
But let's give you a chance now to talk about really the big event. That's the big event that's coming up. We know we're building toward 1 month. In 1 month, the virtual mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington, June the 20th. There was a busload of folks, at least a busload of folks, and others from Fort Wayne heading to Washington, D.C. in a month. And of course, now this is going to be done virtually. Tell us what we can do in this next month to prepare for the virtual assembly and moral march, knowing that there are some people here on this call who may not be aware of the moral march and assembly. And then also when we come online on June 20th, what can we expect?
Great. So yeah,
This
so
is a big question.
Yeah, so we're organizing the largest online gathering and social media gathering of poor people in U.S. history. We were going to be in D.C. For a massive event there, and realized that, you know, that isn't safe. But we also realized that we need to organize more than ever now. And so what we're hoping is that people all over the country, in your congregations, in your organizations, in your labor unions, in your student associations, will turn out thousands or millions of people to tune in to this mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington. You know, where June fits right now is that's when some of these unemployment benefits will be letting up. It's when some of these moratoriums will be letting up. It's probably when we're going to see more of the impacts of the opening up of states. And therefore, you know, we pray that this isn't the case, but potentially, you know, more death and more illness. And it's also right before state budgets are being put together. It's right before, you know, it's right at the longest day of the year, right? June 20th this year is the summer equinox. And so, you know, we need to shine some light on both the problems that are racking our society and the solutions. And so what we'll be doing on June 20th is having a massive online gathering. It will be live streamed, and people all across the country will be tuning in to hear from, you know, those who are fighting and organizing and demanding, you know, living wages and healthcare and all of the rights that we are entitled to and deserve. And so hoping, you know, it's at this point, it's like a 2.5 hour program. You'll get to see a bunch of folks from all the different states that are organizing in the Poor People's Campaign. Folks will get to hear, a little more of the reality from people who are being impacted, by the war economy, by the lack of living wages, by, being children that are being raised in poverty, by racist voter suppression and gerrymandering and attacks on our democracy. And we'll be able to rise together to kind of assert and demand that that everybody has a right to live, and that we won't be silent anymore in the face of this kind of cruel manipulation of the poor. And so we really hope that you can send it out to everybody that you know. It's a Saturday. We will also be broadcasting it on Sunday evening for our Jewish brothers and sisters who maybe can't tune in on a Sabbath. But for those that can, we're really hoping, it will be live at 10 a.m. on June 20th. And we really need to be able to say to the powers that be, this is what matters to the people. These are the issues that folks are fighting over and organizing around. And as we're building a Poor People's Campaign in states across the country, this will be a way to get the message to a broader population, to be able to bring them in so that we can keep on building that power that we were talking about before. And so I really hope that folks, if you're on social media, that you promote June 20th. If you go to june2020.org and register right now that you're going to be there, and then you register 100 of your closest friends to be there with you, that you figure out who else needs to hear about this. We're hoping that before it even happens, we've been able to reach millions and millions and millions of people to know that there's a Poor People's Campaign out there, and that poor people are assembling together and demanding together and marching on Washington, at this point virtually, but together.
I know state campaigns are doing this locally and statewide, and nationally as well. But will there be some marching orders for the upcoming elections, for the national elections? What's the Poor People's Campaign doing in order to help us organize around the country for the national elections in November?
Yeah, so before we were called off the road because of coronavirus, we were on this "We Must Do More" campaign, more right. Mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating people for a movement that votes. We obviously aren't able to travel around anymore, but we've been doing town halls with that theme. We've been doing online mass meetings. In fact, this coming Thursday, the 28th at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time, we have another online mass meeting. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is about mobilizing, organizing, registering, and educating people for a movement, but then to be engaged in voter registration and voter protection, voter education, and voter mobilization for the fall and winter. And we're a nonpartisan movement, but we're deeply political. And we see that so many of the policies that are being passed that are most repressor are happening on a state level. And so we want people to be getting engaged in voting on a local level, on a state level, and on a national level, right? That all of those matter. And that we never endorse a candidate. We won't endorse candidates, but we ask candidates to endorse our agenda, and then folks can vote accordingly. Right, and we're really interested in the political calculus of registering and organizing and getting poor people who may not be voting right now because they don't see good options out there, because nobody's speaking about poverty and low incomes, because they don't see to get involved in this movement. And then as a movement, be able to kind of vote together and organize together to make sure that we actually change this political system to actually serve us, the people, and not just the wealthy, as it has been happening for so long.
We here at Indiana Center for Middle East Peace are concerned for the struggle for Palestinian rights, as you can imagine. And I know that Reverend Barber has been an outspoken advocate too for Palestinian rights. I don't know if you want to say a word about that. I'd like for you to, but let me give you a different angle, and then I'll let you answer the question how you want to do it. While the Poor People's Campaign has mostly been focused on domestic policy, of course, America's war economy, rampant militarism, I mean, they're interrelated, right? It's a real concern too. So say a word about the Poor People's Campaign and foreign policy. And if you want to touch on Palestinian rights from your own personal perspective, I'd appreciate that as well.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the statistics that I haven't said so far today that I would be remiss not to is that, you know, the US government spends 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on the military and less than 15 cents on poverty, healthcare, and education programs combined. And so, you know, what we've been seeing, you know, in this pandemic is that you know, like New York City's budget is going to cut our education budget in half at the same time as we increase our police, right? And that this is happening all over the country, but has impact all over the world. And so for June 20th, we're actually calling on global movements to be in solidarity with the poor who are organizing in this country, as we are in solidarity with poor people across the globe who are organizing. And indeed, seeing the violation of human rights anywhere, the violation of poor people's rights anywhere is a violation of God-given rights. And so, you know, I was raised in a family that's been engaged in justice and peace work for my whole life. I've never been able to visit personally Palestine myself, and it is a lifelong
You'll have
dream.
to come with me.
I would love it. You know, what we have is a lot of folks, you know, in this campaign and at the Cairo Center, where I'm the director, who see the connection of these issues, and see that anywhere that people's rights are being trampled on is against the will of God, and that we need to come together across religion and across nationality and across borders to build a movement of the people from below. And I think there's some beautiful work happening, and so hoping that we can actually, you know, build this kind of global initiative where folks, you know, come together from below and build the world that we dream up, and not just the one that we have, where water is being denied, where peace is overrun, and where you know, folks don't have the right to live right now or to be themselves.
I have just a couple more questions for you, but you know, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there now about where COVID originated. One of the foremost scientific theories, though, is that it's jumped cross species. That is from the Earth to humans, and we haven't really said a lot yet about Earth sustainability, climate change, which is one of the major platforms, one of the major emphases of the Poor People's Campaign. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to say a word about that particular pillar of the Poor People's Campaign.
Indeed. I mean, so we've kind of identified 5 interlocking injustices that the Poor People's Campaign lifts up and sees that we can't get rid of one without getting rid of all of them. And so we started with, you know, the 3 that Dr. King had laid out in 67, 68, of racism, of poverty, and of militarism. And then as we were kind of forming the campaign and connecting up with poor and low-income families all across the country, what kept on coming up to us was this problem of ecological devastation, and the call to save the earth and everything living in and on it. Indeed, it's the same communities that have the highest poverty and the least protections for immigrants that are also, you know, where their Superfund sites are, where the water is poisoned, where climate change and disruptions are wreaking havoc on people's lives. And so indeed, this question of ecological devastation is a central part of all of it. And wherever coronavirus came from, what we do know is that there are storms, there are climatic events, and there are diseases that are spreading and growing because of basically the way that our war economy and military, as well as corporations across the world, have abused the earth and seen it to be a playground for the rich instead of God's creation that we're here to protect. And so I think we in the Poor People's Campaign are trying to connect those in the environmental movement and those in the peace and justice movement with poor people and people of color who are fighting for all of our rights, and see the interconnection of those injustices. Just like coronavirus is actually not impacting people equally, that it really is poor communities, it really is communities of color that are being disproportionately impacted by it. That's same with climate justice issues, that yes, we all need the earth to survive and thrive, but who is most impacted by these climatic disasters are the poor over and again. And so, we must see that interconnection and address it as a significant injustice that again has a solution, right? I mean, that doesn't have to be this way. We don't need to destroy the earth just to make the profits of the rich greater and greater. That isn't what God intended when God said, I have come so that you have life and have it abundantly.
I want to get more personal with you now. Liz, you shared earlier, I mean, your work as a pastor. We talked about, I want to talk about the intersection of your professional life and personal life. You're a pastor. You're a theologian and scholar. I'm a theologian, so we're talking together here. We talked about one of the problems in this country is religious nationalism. That's one of the planks or the kind of the underlying issue of these issues in our country.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about religious people taking back their religion. Talk about that aspect of your professional career and advocacy for the poor professionally. And also your personal faith journey and walk with Jesus. You've written a book, you've co-edited so you've done this already internally. Talk to us a little bit about that intersection of your professional and personal journeys.
Yeah, so I was raised, in a deeply religious family, and I was raised to see that the way you practice your faith is how you treat your neighbor, right? Something like Micah 6:8 was really kind of a guiding text in my life. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with God? And so this kind of justice work, these acts of mercy and kindness, and this discipleship where you give your life to God and follow what God requires of us in this moment. And what does this moment mean but a time of crisis, a time of God's people being trampled on. And so I was raised in a very social justice oriented, faith-based home, and always saw that I was called to love one another and build a more just society, as what God called all of us to do. I met some organized homeless people when I was like 18 years old, and that became my kind of church and community, where I then realized that my call to live and organize amongst homeless people, amongst poor people, amongst low-wage workers was actually a religious call. And that's how I ended up going to seminary and being ordained in the Presbyterian Church and getting a PhD in biblical studies. As I did a lot of the grassroots organizing work I was called to do, I pretty much every week of my life for the past 25 years, I would run into this particular passage of the Bible. I would go to a church meeting, or I'd go to a community gathering, and I would say, we're building a movement to end poverty. And folks would say, oh, but don't you know that Jesus says the poor will be with you always? I went to my ordination committee with this, and they said, well, if you come back saying that you're going to end poverty, we won't be able to ordain you because, that would be going against God. And so I got pretty fascinated with that text. And I encourage folks to pay attention. Now that I've said it, you'll probably hear this passage come up in your lives on a very regular basis. And it's used to justify inaction in the face of poverty. It's used to say that if God wanted to end poverty, he would do so, right? And it's always a he would do so. When folks say if God wanted to end poverty, it's used to say, we'll only be not poor in heaven, and as a way to kind of spiritualize and dematerialize the teachings of the Gospels. And so I got pretty obsessed with that, right? And I started to say, well, what does the Bible really say? Like, is Jesus really condoning poverty? Did God really mess up when God made the amount that we had? Like, or is it actually the way we've decided to organize society? Is it really actually our disobedience to God that allows the kind of poverty and inequality to exist? And so, I have written a book. It's called Always With Us: What Jesus Really Said About the Poor. And
if you weren't going to plug it, I was going to plug it for you. So just so you know.
So as a spoiler, I say in that book that that I do actually think that is the text that we should organize like the whole Bible around. But the message of that text is that poverty is not willed by God. It's our disobedience to God and to the Jubilee and Sabbath prescriptions. It's to our adherence for charity and hypocrisy instead of justice. It's because of our participation in unjust economic systems that poverty is with us, and that if we're truly to follow God's call in any aspect of our lives, it would be to join a movement to end poverty, which is what Jesus was building in his life on earth, and is what Jesus needs for us to be building today. And so, I have a lot of energy and a lot of excitement for a lot, but especially seeing what lessons there are in our biblical texts for poor people organizing today. Because indeed, I think that the Bible is many things, but it also is a collection of stories of poor people coming together with God on their side and organizing society and protesting and building a movement that brings heaven here on earth, which is exactly how it's meant to be. And so, I have a lot to say on these topics, and therefore it comes together in the fact that I'm a pastor, I'm a biblical scholar, but I'm mostly an anti-poverty activist because I understand that to be what God has called me and others to do in this world.
And isn't it wonderful? In the trajectory of your career, I can just picture it, I'm of an age now where I've looked back at the trajectory I can see the trajectory of your career, biblical studies, anti-poverty work, but has led you into broader coalitions with other representatives of other faith traditions,
That's right.
as well as of no faith traditions at all, but people of goodwill.
Exactly. And I went to seminary, my first day of the systematic theology class with James Cone, one of the fathers of Black theology and liberation theology in this country, was 9/11. And it was really an important moment for me because, you know, I was at seminary and all these folks had kind of these crises of faith, because their faith had been, their Christian faith had been that, you know, good things had happened to them along the way and that they would continue to happen. And then here was 9/11 and folks tried to make sense of it. And I developed a really close friendship with a Muslim liberation theologian who was at the seminary at the time I was there, who basically said, Liz, we need to build an interfaith movement. We need to build a multi-faith movement. You know, everything you're telling me about your work amongst the poor and homeless has been interfaith, because poor people are, you know, cover many faith traditions. He's like, but don't run away from your Christianity. It's if you know, can get deep and deep and broad in your understanding of how you're called to do this work from your Christianity, then I can get deep and broad to say why I'm called to do this work from my Muslim theology, and why our brothers and sisters who are Jewish and are Buddhist and are Sikh and are Hindu can do this work because of their theologies and their moral teachings, and that because people are poor from all walks of life, we can come together, you know, and build a multi-faith movement, and a movement of people with no faith, but who believe in the arc of justice bending, and who can, and indeed, you know, build a beautiful world together. And you know, I indeed have seen that to be the case, you know, definitely as my work has progressed.
I want to say thanks for being, just for your personal sharing. No, I resonate with that very much. I'm going to let Reverend Theoharis have the last word. But before I do, I just want to remind you that this interview will be posted on YouTube shortly this evening. Thanks to Terry Doherty, our Indiana Center for Middle East Peace Board Chair, for his technical work for us today. I also want to remind you that this is the second interview of our series, Voices of Justice, Human Rights, and Moral Revival. Next Thursday, May the 8th at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, we'll be hosting Dr. Mustafa Barghouti from Ramallah, Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative Political Party, a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council, and founder of the Palestinian Medical Relief Society. So please share the news of our series of interviews with your friends. And you can find information about that on the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace Facebook page and website. So Reverend Liz Theoharis, thank you for coming today. June2020.org. I know you want me to repeat that again. And do you have any parting words for us?
I might just close us in a prayer, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right. So let us pray. God of justice and truth, we lift up to you 140 million of your people who are being abandoned in the midst of abundance, and the millions more being impacted by this public health crisis. Grant us the wisdom to know that plague in the Bible is not a storm weathered before a return to normalcy, but a call to come together in new ways in order to survive, to hold the powerful responsible for unjust policies and lies, and to rebuild foundations of love and justice. Grant us the courage to press on as we resist the degradation of human life and the temptation of the powerful to profit from pandemic. Grant us the love to do your will, to preach good news to the poor and comfort to the broken and brokenhearted. May we know that we are called to make earth as it is in heaven, and since it is your will, may we make it so. Amen.
Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, Poor People's Campaign. Folks, June2020.org. Thanks to you, Liz, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We'll see you all next Thursday. Peace, everyone.
Peace.
So as folks leave, Liz, maybe you and I could have a chat if you don't mind.